In the passing at age 79 of the disgraced former president, General Pervez Musharraf, the world has witnessed the end of a quintessential Pakistani strongman whose perpetual angst was against India, but whose delusions of influence were global. Musharraf died in Dubai in exile today from a country he once ruled with varying degrees of draconian rule, including suspending its constitution, imposing martial law, and making widespread civilian arrests. That was just one part of his preoccupations, the others being setting off a reckless war with India over the Himalayan region of Kargil between May and July 1999, and running with the hare and hunting with the hounds during the Afghan war waged by the US from 2002. On the face of it, he seemed to have closely allied with America in its feckless invasion of Afghanistan, even while being indulgent towards both the Taliban and Osama bin Laden. Mayank Reports and South Asia Monitor spoke to Uday Bhaskar, a retired Indian Navy Commodore and one of India's most astute strategic and defense minds. Uday Bhaskar. I want to start with something very specific and very focused, something that you have pointed out. Pervez Musharraf's angst and animus against India were largely defined by Pakistan's humiliation in the 1971 war with India. And also, by the way, India snatched control of the Siachen Glacier sometime in 1984. What is your view of him in the context of the subcontinental history?
I would characterize late General Musharraf as a very complex military leader. He was the Pakistani army chief. And from there, of course, he seized power in a bloodless coup and overthrew the Prime Minister, Mr. Nawaz Sharif, at that time. And subsequently, he was concurrently the army chief and the president of Pakistan till November 2007, so it's almost 8 years from the time he seized power in October 1999. And then, for a variety of domestic reasons, he handed over the baton of the army chief to General Kayani, but he continued as president till mid 2008. So, if you look at that period and the history of the subcontinent, I would say his contribution was substantive, but alas, in a very negative manner. Because if you review objectively the history of both Pakistan and the extended subcontinent, in which I would like to also include Afghanistan, I think history may bear me out if I use this kind of a characterization and say that yes, it was substantive, but in a very negative manner because of the corrosive effect that many of his initiatives have had, both for Pakistan and for Afghanistan and for India as well. Because, again, if you recall, it was on his watch that the world had to deal with 9/11 and the fallout of 9/11. And India was dealing with December 2001, the attack on the Indian Parliament, which in turn was preceded by a fair amount of the jihadi fervor that was unleashed against India. So, in summary, I would say that he did make a contribution. He also, I think, challenged a lot of red lines when he embarked on Kargil, the war in 1999, because that took place literally a few months after India and Pakistan had demonstrated their nuclear weapon capability. My sort of reconstruction being that almost all the tactical evidence points to the fact that soon after the Lahore Accord was signed between Prime Minister Vajpayee and Mr. Nawaz Sharif in early 1999, preparations had already been made for the Kargil war by way of the quote unquote intruders and the kind of support they had already received as they hunkered down for the winter. So, all of this put together, I would say he was feckless, an adventurist, and I think he has taken Pakistan down a path. And those corrosive, I think the blowback, if you will, is something that Pakistan is experiencing even now as we speak.
Right.
Mine?
Right. Yet to think that 28 years after the 1971 war, it's that for that long he harbored the humiliation. He was a young officer during the 71 war. He joined in 61 the Pakistani army. So he must have been a fairly senior officer by the time 1971 took place. And to
Well, I wouldn't say
harbor,
very senior because just to correct, put this in context, mine. He joined the PMA, the Pakistani Military Academy, in 1961.
I say,
So
okay,
he was born in 43.
right.
So 61, he was 18 years old. He would have gone through 3 or 4 years of training. So he would have been a relatively young officer of about 8 to 9 years of service, perhaps a major.
Right,
He was a
right. So
gunner, an artillery officer. Yeah.
yeah. No, for him to harbor that animus and humiliation for close to 3 decades and then carry it out in 1999, the Kargil adventure, misadventure, however you want to call it, and that too in the context of two nuclear armed powers, Pakistan and India. What kind of mindset does it take for him to do what he did? And that too, once again, sorry to continue, completely unknown to his own prime minister, Nawaz Sharif.
I think, Mike, actually, you are raising a very important, I think, question and an issue, which is the strategic culture of the Pakistani army in particular, which most students of Pakistan and its military would perhaps agree that Rawalpindi, which is the GHQ of the Pakistani army, exudes a very different kind of strategic culture as compared to the other two services, meaning the Air Force and the very small, diminutive Pakistani Navy. In that sense, when you say it is true empirically that for 28 years after the 71 war, you had Major Pervez Musharraf who perhaps internalized the humiliation of the loss of East Pakistan and the fact that more than 90,000 prisoners of war had been captured by India. It was a humiliating defeat for Pakistan at that time. And it's interesting that if you see the training patterns of the Pakistani military, particularly the army, after 71, they take an oath to avenge the humiliation of 71. That is how many of their officers after retirement have also justified the kind of deep animus that they have against India as an entity. And for General Musharraf, by the time we come to 1984, when India was able to consolidate its position on the Siachen Glacier,
Right.
he was, if I remember right, a brigadier by then. And he was fully, I think, tactically aware of what had happened and how India was able to turn the tables and gain an almost unassailable kind of tactical position as far as the glacier was concerned. This was 84. And this, in a way, added to the trauma of 1971.
Right.
So, from there, if I remember the trajectory professionally for General Musharraf, he had moved to the equivalent of the Military Operations Directorate. And clearly, he was able to make certain tactical plans because if you look at that topography, at one level, the Kargil adventure, misadventure, recklessness, whatever you call it, ostensibly was tactically very brilliant because had he succeeded in preventing India from accessing NH1, as they call it, then it would have been a difficult tactical situation for India. But he was not able to move in the manner that he thought he could. And the Indian response, even though it was slightly delayed, completely, I think, unnerved Pakistan at the strategic level and militarily, literally peak by peak. If you remember the young Indian soldiers, both officers and men, and their leadership, You remember that ye dil mange more
Right.
kind of sentiment that animated Kargil at that time. So, despite very severe odds, and I think this is graphically better understood when you say that, when you realize that in the most inhospitable climatic conditions, Indian troops were scaling peaks which were almost inclined to 70 degrees, if you will, and yet they were able to capture the peaks where the intruders, the Pakistani military, had entrenched itself. That, I think, was not only a tactical setback for the Pakistani army in particular, for General Musharraf, who was the army chief at that time, the fact that, as you said, he had not even kept his prime minister in the loop. Incidentally, he had not even kept the naval chief and the Pakistani Air Force in the loop. So that
Really?
shows you how, at one level, he was so full of himself, the certitude that the Pakistani army could complete the operation in a few weeks at best. So, all this kind of misplaced certitude, and to me, again, as a student of Pakistan and its military and the regional dynamic, what struck me, because we all spent a lot of time studying the Kargil war for many years after the July 4th accord that was signed in Blair House when then US President Mr. Bill Clinton had, in a way, I think, was the Sherpa for this.
Right.
Years after, when we studied the war, I think this is another indicator of Pakistan's strategic culture and General Musharraf in particular, that you go for this high stakes gamble. And this in a region where both countries had just become nuclear weapon powers. So again, I think it was the prudence of Mr. Vajpayee as the prime minister and his very firm hand on the tiller and his ability to reassure the rest of the world that we do not seek a war with Pakistan. We are confining it tactically to that sector. But we will push back with all the resolve that India could bring to bear at that time. And I think that was the big takeaway for me, that the political leadership of India at that time burnished India's credibility as a responsible state in terms of husbanding or looking after the nuclear weapon. And Pakistan was a contrast by way of its reckless initiative in Kargil. And if you remember, the Pakistani PR to the UN at that time in New York issued a not so subtle threat that Pakistan could take recourse to its recently acquired nuclear weapons.
Right.
And the whole world was not only incensed, but they gave a very sharp rap to Pakistan on its knuckles. Even China, an all time, all weather friend of Pakistan, was very dismayed at that time. So I think this would give you a sense, as I said, about General Musharraf's own persona and the strategic culture of the Pakistani army at that time, where they thought they could support terrorism on one hand, acquire nuclear weapons, and carry out what I think many Indian analysts have pointed out, that you have terrorism behind a nuclear shield, or you have the equivalent of nuclear weapon enabled terror. It's been
Right.
differently formulated. So, this I think was the contribution of General Musharraf by way of his adventurous streak. Right?
Uh, Speaking of his persona that you mentioned, I'm dwelling a bit into his psychology, which might be a bit foolish thing to do, but nevertheless, how much do you think he was overcompensating for his very brief childhood in Delhi? He must have been barely three or so when he had to leave, I suppose, perhaps four with his family. Do you think that ever played at the back of his mind when he was doing whatever he was doing in the context of India?
Again, I think this is a very complex and rich area to explore, which is my reading again, is that in Pakistan, General Musharraf represented what is broadly referred to as the Muhajirs,
Right.
those who had gone from undivided India to Pakistan but they did not ethnically belong to the primary ethnicities of what we used to refer to as West Pakistan before West Punjab, I beg your pardon,
Right.
before partition in August 1947. So, what became Pakistan was referred to largely as West Punjab, and of course, it had the Pashtun areas and Sindh. So, the Mohajir represented an ethnicity that was neither Sindhi, nor Punjabi, nor Pashtun, or for that matter, Baloch.
Right.
And in the Pakistani army in particular, all Mohajirs, particularly officers, had to do that extra mile
Exactly.
to prove and, in a way, I think, demonstrate their commitment to the Pakistani flag, to Islam, and carry this deep hatred against India. Not just army officers, we also know certain diplomats who had a similar kind of animus. We know certain politicians, and we have a person like the disgraced scientist Dr. A.Q. Khan.
Indeed.
All of them had connections with undivided India, ethnically did not belong to modern Pakistan post August 47. And I think this played a role. And there's a lot of ambivalence here and contradictions when it comes to General Musharraf in particular,
Right.
because you remember that whenever he came to India, for instance, the mandatory visit to the Ajmer Dargah
Yeah.
and recalling his own roots in India, where he was born, and anecdotal kind of evidence in Pakistan's social circles says that he was also very enamored with Hindi film songs.
Right.
And there was a certain period, a genre that he apparently could sing, and many of them were romantic songs. I'm just trying to draw attention to one layer of the persona of
Yeah.
Pervez Musharraf, the person, as opposed to General Musharraf, and the ambivalence and the contradictions in terms of how he related to the land of his birth, which politically was the enemy or the adversary for him as he grew in the Pakistani army. So it was
Yeah.
complex, but it was definitely there. That's my reading.
No, I agree. In fact, the feudal Punjabi establishment always looked down upon the Mohajir. That's why you had the whole MQM, the Mohajir Qaumi
Yeah, yeah,
movement.
yeah.
And like you pointed out, many of these prominent figures were trying to prove themselves much more than people from that region might have attempted. So there is something to explore there. Just last couple of things. How do you see him in the long tradition of Pakistani generals such as Ayub Khan or Yahya Khan, or more particularly someone like Ziaul Haq, who was quite a wily and crafty character?
It's too early now, Mayank, but my preliminary thoughts are that if you look at the contribution of General Musharraf against this quartet, as you rightly pointed out, there are four generals, starting with General later Field Marshal Ayub Khan, followed by General Yahya, and then General Ziaul Haq, and later General Musharraf. I would say that in comparison, in a relative manner, he comes across favorably. I'll tell you why I'm saying this. It may sound a bit odd because here I have gone to length talking about his corrosive impact. But if you look at each of them, I think between Ayub Khan, General Ayub Khan, and General Musharraf, you had two generals who really took Pakistan, I think, down the tubes, if I may use such a strong expression. And this, of course, was the loss of East Pakistan in 1971, which was on the second military general who took power in Pakistan, General Yahya Khan. And then you had the Islamization of Pakistan and its polity, which was the contribution of General Ziaul Haq. And that, I think, was where, in many ways, a very negative DNA enters the Pakistani body politic. And I use the word negative in a very objective way to say that with this steady Islamization, you see the beginning of the jihadi fervor. And there are more complex reasons. I'm not placing everything
Right.
on Pakistan's doorstep. We had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We had President Ronald Reagan in the US. After all, we had a time when Osama bin Laden himself was eulogized in the US, particularly by the
Absolutely.
US president, of the brave Mujahideen, Quran in one hand, Kalashnikov in the other, defenders of
Yes.
the faith, and so on. But this was the contribution during the Zia years, the Islamization of Pakistan, its polity, and the way in which I think the whole concept of strategic depth, which really took root in the early 90s after the end of the Cold War on Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto's watch, if you remember,
Right.
and the kind of blowback. Today, if Pakistan is facing its internal crisis, and we've had not only the dastardly killings in the Peshawar school, but most recently in the Peshawar mosque, which is literally a week, 10 days old. But all of this, I would say, is the contribution by osmosis of seeds that was sown during the Zia years. It's against this backdrop, if you look at General Musharraf, he tried at one point, soon after 9/11, to restore a certain amount of, I would say, order into Pakistan. And he gave that very famous speech of his when he said that Pakistan should return to a more rational kind of decision making in relation to religion and terrorism. But that was very brief.
Right.
And some people say that it was a very cynical way of trying to appease the Americans at that point in time. But as I said, within Pakistan, he was seen as a force for moderation. He gave the media a fairly free hand, and people saw him as almost a liberal dictator. But all of that, again, as I said, did not yield to any long term results. But in relation to India, I think twice he tried to embark on the dialogue for peace.
Right.
Agra, we know what happened. Prime Minister Vajpayee was at the helm of affairs here in India. It was an aborted attempt, again, for a variety of complex reasons. He tried to be, I think, to my mind, too clever by half in terms of what he was seeking. And most recently, on his watch before he went out in disgrace, was the attempt with Dr. Manmohan Singh, where, if
Right.
you remember, we had the back channel, the 4 point proposal. All the interlocutors at that time, who, of course, most of this is opaque, it's not quite in the public domain, but it seemed as if both sides were reaching some kind of a modus vivendi, which is that the line of control would become a line of contact in a very tentative manner. And then hopefully the grid could have allowed greater interaction. But all of that didn't happen. I often say that the India Pakistan peace dialogue is a bit like the myth of Sisyphus. You think you're reaching, some kind of fruition. And again, the boulder rolls back to the very bottom. But this is the reason why I'm saying in a slightly, I would say, elaborate and detailed manner that relative to his other
Right.
peers, the three generals, he may come across more favorably. But frankly, it's the people of Pakistan who will have to forgive General Musharraf and his legacy,
Yeah.
even as he is, laid to rest.
Right. Speaking of his legacy, the last one or two things. How do you see his positioning of Pakistan as a US ally in the aftermath of 9/11, even as he seemed to play footsie with both the Taliban as well as Osama bin Laden? It's like he was riding two horses. One
You
was
know,
going in one direction, the other in another direction, and
yeah,
yet he managed for a while.
I would say tactically he seemed to be very deft, meaning
Hmm.
that after 9/11 he was able to hunt with the US hound in terms of being part of the global war on terror, and he even acquired the status of a major non-NATO ally.
Right.
But while hunting with the hound, he was also running with the jihadi hare. And he could, in a way, I think, con the Americans, or Americans allowed themselves to be conned and they turned a Nelson's eye for years. So that was, I would say, deft at the tactical level. He managed to maintain a very robust relationship with China and to a certain extent also with Moscow. And he
Right.
was aware of the fact that Pakistan had a very covert, below the radar relationship with Israel. when the Soviet Union had entered Afghanistan at the time of the Gorbachev years. So all of this is something that was managed, I would say, tactically in a deft manner. But the price paid by Pakistan at a strategic level has been very high. That's why I keep saying that his legacy for his people is something that has
Right.
bled them, many of them to death. Thousands
So,
more have been maimed
so
in the
you,
kind of forces that have been unleashed, particularly the Tehreek Taliban Pakistan, the Lashkar, and all the other affiliates. And whenever you think of Pakistan, to me, the tragedy is what happened in Peshawar. If you remember that attack on the school,
right.
and the children who died were by and large children of the Pakistani Fauj. And as is often said, it is the coffins of the young that are the heaviest to bear and carry. And I think that is the legacy that General Musharraf will be long remembered. And in passing, I also want to say that one more stain on his palm is the assassination of the former Prime Minister, Miss Benazir Bhutto, December 2007.
Yes.
Now, that's almost 16 years ago, 15 years ago. But all the reading that I have done and spoken to various people, many years later, I tracked 2 seminars and conferences with Pakistani interlocutors, including some who were in positions of power at that time in the security and intelligence establishment. In a very guarded way, they do agree that at that time, as the army chief and the president, General Musharraf could have ensured that Miss Benazir Bhutto was not assassinated in that manner.
Yeah.
Mind you, he himself was a target of assassination attempt,
He was. Yes.
General Musharraf. But I still feel that, it's too early. It's less than 24 hours since General Musharraf breathed his last. So one cannot be too definitive. But I would say that it's a very mixed and
Right.
tainted legacy, if I could put it that
And to conclude, from what began in 1999 to what it is now, there is a thread when Pakistan is practically facing bankruptcy. What he started then, the price is being paid now in many ways. Would you agree?
I would agree because I think many of the initiatives that were taken at that time, for instance, one, the support to terrorism that was being exported. The second was, again, I think this very misplaced decision that investing in the Taliban in Afghanistan would give Pakistan strategic depth. Now it's been completely stood on its head, and it is the Taliban in Kabul and their affiliates in Pakistan, the TTP, who have acquired strategic depth in Pakistan.
Yes.
And you have a large cross section within Pakistan that is ideologically more or less persuaded by what the Taliban is practicing in Kabul. And if the TTP is successful and establishes its own control in the Pakhtunkhwa
Mm.
area, we would have a large swathe of southern Asia that is under the rule of the Taliban and its own interpretation of Islamic law. And what that will do to the women, particularly, and the girl child, is tragic with a capital T, I mean. And that, I would
And,
say, is part of the legacy of General Musharraf because he had 8 years in power to reverse,
and he
but
did not.
he chose not to. As I said, it was this duplicity of hunting with the hound and running with the hare.